Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. We'll be talking today about the top 10 trends for enterprise machine learning in 2021. Thank you so much for the TWiML organizers, and thank you very much, Sam, for the opportunity of being here. It's great to see what great conference and products been put here together. So without further ado, let me jump in real quick and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the market in terms of enterprise machine learning. So super quick introduction. My name is Diego Oppenheimer. I am the CEO and founder of Algorithmia. We're a leading machine learning operations and management platform. I spent most of my career working in data tools and analytics and got my undergrad and grad school degrees from Carnegie Mellon University. If anybody ever wants to chat with me, I'm active on Twitter and my Twitter handle is there, or you can always send me a note directly on LinkedIn. So high level, to explain a little bit what's going on here. So every year, Algorithmia, this is our third year in a row, conducts a random sampling of enterprise machine learning practitioners. This includes everybody from CEOs, CXOs, managers, VPs, practitioners, into how are they looking at what's coming up, what are the trends, what are the concerns, what are some of the problems that they're seeing in terms of adopting machine learning as that technology. Just to give you a little bit of a breakdown, we talk to mostly people inside organizations with $100 million in revenue or above, and this is conducted by a completely independent third party. So that's something that we make sure that is unbiased from that perspective in terms of how the correspondents are actually working around that. And so we can see here a little bit of the the breakdown in terms of who participated in this. To give a little bit of the population, you can see some of the concerns and kind of the problems that are going to bring up make a lot of sense as you look at this distribution. So a couple of themes came up when doing this, and really the key themes that were captured, we try to put those all into a couple of buckets. And some of the things that we're seeing is a general priority shift. So, in economic uncertainty with the pandemic, with COVID, we're seeing how organizations are actually dramatically increasing their AI ML investment across the board. This makes sense. Machine learning is a great optimization approach for everything from sales excellence to IT excellence. It helps reduce costs as well as increase revenues. And so seeing that the organizations are doubling down on this technology as because of the pandemic and move towards digitization makes a lot of sense. We still see a number of challenges that are continue to pop up. This really is across different pieces of the ML lifecycle. There's basic challenges that enterprises are hitting head on, and they're responding towards that. As there's been an explosion of tooling and investment, organizations are actually spending even more time and resources on model deployment. And a lot of this is due to the tool sprawl and technical debt in terms of do-it-yourself and one-off components that have been built. This has been a response from the market. There wasn't an option of going out and either buying or using a canonical stack around how to do machine learning. And so what organizations are seeing is that the different components that they put together is actually starting to increase a massive amount of technical debt, and that's becoming problematic. And then, one of the things that really came up is that for those organizations that have adopted an MLOps solution, or third-party solutions, they've actually seen an increase in improved outcomes, and that was it was conclusive from the data on what they're seeing as a general approach and success when looking at this space. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what I mean by the priority shifts. So one of the clear things that we're seeing is an increased budget in terms of how to approach AI and machine learning. This is everything from headcount to spending on tooling to spending on compute. There's been a clear increase in budgets as we approach the next fiscal year. One of the main things that we see, one of the biggest ones that we've seen, that the average amount of data scientists employed inside these organizations have actually increased by 76% on average. And this is, if we look at the distribution from previous year to this year in terms of number of data scientists, you can kind of see that distribution. But the core thing that we're seeing is that large organizations are employing data scientists and people into their data science and machine learning efforts at an increasing rate. And that doesn't seem to be slowing down at all inside our respondents. So when we start looking at where these use cases are being applied, so we're kind of seeing, like, we ask all the respondents, okay, where are you actually applying ML? Where are you seeing success? And where are those use cases really being driven? So the customer experience and process automation. So customer experience, things like generating customer insights, improving customer experience, interacting with customers, have taken the lead in terms of the use cases where ML has been proven to be a moving the needle factor, and therefore investment continues to be done in those use cases. The other aspect of it is really what we call kind of process automation. Anything that can be optimized on the back end, anything that can be automated is being also increased because there's a clear reduction in operational cost of being able to approach these use cases. And these have really bubbled up, even though there's a pretty good variety of the number of use cases that are popping up in this space. These two are really noted to being like the main drivers inside large organizations for the machine learning efforts. So one thing I'm going to point out here is that if you have any questions throughout any of the things that I'm talking about, any clarifications, please use the chat box. We'll be taking all these questions and being able to answer them at the end of the session. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions, clarifications throughout the presentation today. We'd be more than happy to actually go and answer those. So when looking at customer experience, that trend number 2 in automation, we newly see that, in all use cases, almost 50% of more organizations are actually increasing their usage of ML. So as we broke down the categories of what are the use cases that you're applying AI and ML to, we pretty much saw an increase across every single use case in terms of the investment, and almost no reduction, decreases whatsoever. So again, a general trend that there's organizations are looking at this, they're looking at it strategically, and they're actually doubling down on their investments that they've seen in the previous years. So 2021 is really being set up for be a knockout year for investments in this space. So another trend that we saw is that there's an increasing gap between what we call the haves and the have-nots. And when we really double click into that is you look and you say the number of models in production that large organizations are able to achieve is much larger than the ones that the smaller organizations can approach. And so when we kind of divide the world up into 25,000 or less employees, 25,000 or more employees, we can actually see there's a clear trend towards the large organizations are managing to deploy and run and have more use cases in machine learning and are continuing to invest aggressively in its ability of industrializing their ML around all these use cases that are actually being approached inside their organization. So that doesn't say that there's not a lot of challenges. So when we actually looked at the challenges that these organizations are approaching, we asked, okay, where are you focusing your time? What are the gaps that you have in your organization in terms of actually being able to say, hey, we want to be able to use any sort of use case, apply ML to it. What are those gaps and where do you need to get to? And so two things that really came out to be a key. The number one is governance. So almost 56% of organizations are struggling with governance, security, and auditability of machine learning. This means that as you actually are building out use cases, as you're building software that is going to be having a predictive component to it and integrating machine learning techniques, now has brought to surface that it's a pretty complex thing to do. How do we do IT governance around this? How do I do security? How do I do auditability around that? And this is the number one concern that has popped out of these organizations. How do we address this? How are we going to move forward? How are we going to make this in a repeatable, scalable, and fast way? And then the second big challenge is really around integrations, compatibility between the wide variety of ML technologies, programming languages, and frameworks. And these really have been the two things that really popped up that saying, hey, for us to be successful in our mission of applying AI and ML to our use cases, these are the two things that really need to be solved from an organizational perspective and are front and center of how large enterprises are focusing on the world of ML. So when we break this all down, we see a 67% of organizations that actually need to comply with one or more regulations that would affect how they apply ML internally to their use cases. And so again, organizations are now looking at it, they have mandates around compliance and regulatory things, and they have more than one that they need to do. So thinking about this at a global level from a governance perspective, how are we going to actually comply with these regulations? How are we going to make sure that our organization is following them and is around that is number one, it's a main use case that organizations are really concentrating on. The second big issue is around integration and compatibility. And so 56% of organizations are struggling with governance, security. We talked a little bit about that, but the second level is 49% of these are actually struggling with integration. This is where going back to that technical debt problem. As we actually have multiple different technologies, multiple different frameworks, multiple different data sources, how do we make this puzzle all work together? More importantly, how do we make this puzzle work all together in a repeatable and scalable way? So if I actually want to take the lens of, hey, how do we industrialize ML in the same way that we've industrialized software development inside our organization? And what I mean by that is kind of the DevOps philosophy of building repeatability, building scale, being backups. How do we actually apply that to all these technologies? And ML has become another main point of struggle that large organizations are having and are approaching and thinking holistically now, how are we going to actually move forward and how are we going to move the ball forward in this to be able to be successful? And then one of the main things around trends is something we call the need for organizational alignment. So in any product or any software, it's imperative, it's imperative that we actually see, clear support from the decision makers so that they can unblock use cases, unblock red tape, and move forward. And so one of the things that we're seeing is a wide variety of personas really being participating in when a successful AI and ML initiative becomes. And I think one clear thing that's popped up from last survey to this survey is this involvement of the IT infrastructure and operational leaders. What we would consider traditionally the DevOps organization, the CIO's organization, the IT org and organization. They are now becoming a much more involved and important factor in actually successful deployment of ML technologies and scale out of ML technologies in large enterprises. And so, my belief is that this is actually a great trend. It means, usually when IT infrastructure and operational leaders are involved, we're thinking about how to do this in a repeatable way, how to do this in a scalable way, and how do we actually be able to actually participate and make this widely available to an organization. So the fact that these leaders have now actually become, we're seeing the success rate of ML, kind of like initiatives being tied also a clear path to the earlier these IT leaders are involved, the more success we're seeing in this. I think this is a clear trend of what we're seeing, that ML is leaving that innovation kind of like, experimentation phase into something that is actually being built for enterprise scale and repeatability. So maturity is actually limited by some alignment issues. And what we talk about is there's a couple of gaps in terms of maturity. We asked a whole bunch of the organizations, where do you feel your organization is from an organizational alignment? The IT folks talk to the DevOps folks, talk to the AI and ML folks. Does your C leadership believe that, you haven't, there's a way of organizationally approaching these problems? And we ask organizations to classify themselves into low, medium, and high maturity. And so we see that actually an organizational alignment, is one of the places that there's usually only medium, the organizational alignment. And that is a clear indicator that, being able to talk globally, be able to talk across the organization becomes that much more important. And then we ask different organizations to classify them on where do you think you are from a maturity level, from a model development, data, training perspective, where do you think you are from a deployment, management, and operations perspective, and then where your maturity is from a governance and compliance perspective. And again, this is self-reflecting, so we ask organizations to identify where they think they are on this journey. And you can see clearly that not all of the things match up, so which makes sense given the self-reported survey. So the bottom line, kind of overall, to kind of think about it, is that there's kind of 5 trends that or buckets of things that really matter for an inefficient machine learning lifecycle. We call it the stuck in the lab problem, which is we have a data science team, a machine learning team that can access data, but they have no path to production. They have no way of actually thinking, okay, great, we built this great technology, we built this, we can show good results. How do we actually get this into production? What's that path look like? What are the people involved? Then we see disconnected teams. So very rarely do we see kind of unicorn teams where the DevOps, IT, and machine learning teams are all perfectly aligned and in sync. And so that disconnection actually creates the world where we see a lot of build a model, throw it over the wall, expect somebody else to productionize it. Where does that communication happen? How do we talk about repeatability and backup recovery and audit controls when, you know, the other side of the conversation is to talk about experiment tracking and data access? We see this wide variety of technology mismatch. So the ability to use CPUs and GPUs, the dozens of different frameworks and workbenches that exist out there. How do we actually make these things all work together? How do we look at it from a platform perspective and say, hey, how do I actually tie all of these things together and make them work efficiently? Stakeholder buy-in, again, that goes back to that organizational alignment thing, which is how do we actually, once leaders see that there's success, that usually involves a bigger investment. So if we go back to that first data point around, we're seeing an increased investment. We think that, you know, those organizations that have actually been able to manage good stakeholder buy-in are the ones that are actually driving that reinvestment. And then I talked about the hidden technical debt, like the repeatability, the fact that tomorrow you're going to have way more machine learning models in production than you have today. So how do you think about that scale out? How do you think about that repeatability? How do we stop doing one-offs, which only increase the pile up, the hidden technical debt? Each one of these factors is compounding into what we call an inefficient machine learning lifecycle. And this is really what needs to be attacked from an organizational perspective for that, you know, to actually industrialize ML within organizations. So when we talk about the technical debt piling up, right, what we're actually seeing is that there's, you know, one would think with all this investment and all this tooling, the actual time to deploy a model would actually have gone down or there have been efficiencies. But that is actually not the case. We're actually seeing an increase in the time it takes to deploy models into production inside these large organizations. A lot of this is driven, again, by like the governance controls, the ability to do that, the actually being able to integrate into IT systems. All of these factors that are now coming to play have actually increased the amount it's taking for organizations to deploy their models. And this is compounding as those new use cases actually show up. So we're still seeing that data scientists are still spending way too much time on deployment. So 38% of organizations spend more than 50% of their data scientist team on deployment. And, you know, I usually laugh around and think, you know, you're having a data scientist, they're a Formula One racer, you're asking them to fix the car as well. You're asking them to tune the motor. That is not a good way of using these super valuable resources. What we want is the data science teams to be working on the use cases, working on the business cases, actually working on the statistical models that can actually move the P&L of an organization forward. And we want to decrease the amount of time that they're spending on infrastructure deployment related tasks. So when we look at that trend, you know, it actually is even more stark as you get more models. So it's not crazy to think of, obviously, this case, more models, more time. But when we see, like, as organizations that have actually deployed and built out more models into production, they're actually seeing an increase in that, in the deployment, not less. And so then finally, let's go into the MLAP preferences and kind of how that's actually playing out. So one of the things that was clear is that buying third-party solutions cost was almost 20% less than building it your own. And so what we did is we actually took a survey inside, some of the data points in terms of what they were spending on the high end, what they were spending on the low end, and from a build from scratch or do it yourself, put together a whole bunch of open source tooling versus buying a third-party solution that might actually accelerate an organization's ability to industrialize ML inside that organization. Again, if what we're looking to do is capture all those use cases that are coming up to light that are becoming super important, what's our fastest path to those use cases being activated inside an organization? And there's a clear trend that actually having a well thought out MLOps solution drove efficiencies in this particular vertical. So when we look at, organizations and the average number of data scientists, and how much time they're spending on model deployment, there's also a clear decrease in looking at an MLOps solution in terms of deployment. So if we go look at, all these data points put together, massive amount of increase in data scientists, massive amount of increase in models deployed. What we're seeing is more time being spent. Now we can actually do a side-by-side comparison and saying, okay, those organizations that have all those models and are spending all those time, are you spending more or less when you have an MLOps solution that's actually helping you with that industrialization aspect? And there's a clear trend showing that the average time spent when deploying is actually decreases. And all that matters is really outcomes, right? How do we actually lower the time required to deploy? So a model that's not in production, a model that's not deployed, is a model that doesn't have ROI. So what we're really thinking about is the clock between ideation and actually being in production. Every second that goes by there is actually time that we're actually not enjoying the ROI of that machine learning model, that machine learning pipeline. And so what we could also see is that when using a third-party MLOps solution, and that decrease in time, we're actually getting the time to value in a lot faster way. So when you think about quickly reacting to market opportunities, quickly reacting to pandemics, quickly reacting to how organizations need to apply, machine learning, every day counts. And we see that being able to abstract, integrate, and actually have a repeatable, scalable, and secure way of deploying machine learning pipelines is actually allowing these organizations to attack those opportunities in a much faster way. So finally, just to kind of give you a couple of parting thoughts, 2021 is going to be the year of ML. We're seeing a massive increase in AI and ML initiatives, and there's an increase in urgency. So time to market matters. The ability to apply machine learning to workloads inside an organization has never been more accessible. The amount of tooling has exploded. The barrier of entry has lowered. The amount of organizations that have digitized all their signals, their data, and that are now treating their data as first-class citizens inside an organization, meaning that they can actually start applying ML initiatives, has increased. And to be able to do this in a repeatable way, you really need to be thinking about MLOps and how you're going to achieve operational efficiency in your machine learning efforts to be able to reap these benefits in 2021. So please go download the survey. It's available for free at the tinyurl.com/TWiML. I am more than happy to be answering questions and excited about asking those. Please reach out to us. We're happy to share data points and examples, and looking forward to hearing all your feedback on what you're seeing inside organizations in 2021. Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Let's get Diego up here. Diego, thanks so much for the presentation and for sharing that survey.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam.
Diego and I were in the private chat reminiscing about our kind of first meeting at the AWS reInvent conference many years ago. He said I was this guy running around with this little recorder, and he had his slide deck pitching Algorithmia, and we got to know each other first there. If you've got any questions about the survey or presentation, get them over in the chat. But Diego, I'll start things off by having you kind of riff on this idea of 2021 being the year of machine learning. Is it machine learning, MLOps? It feels like the year of MLOps to me, but I may be too deep in it. How do you put that into perspective based on the companies that you've been working with over these years?
Yeah, so I think I would actually start with saying 2021 is kind of like the year of results. So, a lot of change happened in 2020. There was a lot of, we went a little bit through this kind of chasm of hey, is this AI thing going to work? How are we going to apply it? There's enough, this conference shows it. There's enough organizations out there that have actually gotten really interesting results. And they've actually been able to showcase that machine learning can move a business. That machine learning can actually really change things for an organization. And part of it is just the journey, right? Do I have the right data, the signals? Have I figured out how to do that? Okay, well, how do we actually work with that? There's all this tooling around building models and experiments and exploration. It's never been accessible. Okay, great. Now we need to get that into production, right? So we actually can show those results. And so I think the explosion, obviously I'm a little bit biased, I'd say MLOps. I actually think it's just the year of like being able to put all the pieces together and actually get the actual solutions out there, the results, and success, leads to more success. So, we heard great people during this conference talking about like how they've changed the business, how they've implemented all these different pipelines. That just shows the rest of an organization, hey, we should continue investing in this. And when you start thinking about how do you continue investing in this, you start thinking about that industrialization aspect. Okay, how are we going to do this in a repeatable way? How do we do this over and over again? If we really wanted to, we've digitized our entire business. How do we apply ML to like every aspect of our business? That's what I think is going to happen in 2021, where the organizations are really doubling down on that. And that's extremely exciting because it's kind of that promise of, I think from our first conversation that we had many, many years ago, I was like saying, look, this is the greatest technology of our lifetime. Like ML is, it's going to affect everything from the digital to the physical world. And it's just a question of providing all the tool sets so you can get there in a repeatable way. And I think all the pieces are coming together and the results are speaking for themselves. I mean, like companies are really moving their entire businesses based on their ML workloads.
There's a really interesting meta thread happening in the chat around this idea of throw it over the wall. When I think back to the early days before, ML platforms and tools were really even a thing. Back when the first such tools were available, the problem that they were trying to solve almost universally was you'd have someone who was like a stats person in the business and they worked in R or SAS or something, and they created these models and they wanted to get them into production, and they would literally throw them over the wall to a developer who would code them up in C++ or Java or what have you. And then we kind of moved to this model where, well, no, a lot of the technologies that are coming about are trying to make it so that, that statistically minded person, whether they're a data scientist or a modeler, can get models into production themselves. And then, some others, it came up in the conversation with Chris Albin this morning, take the view, well, no, now we're going to stand up this MLOps organization, and their role is to take the models from the data scientists and get everything into production. So we're there's a pendulum here, and I'm curious if you can comment on, what you're seeing in your survey results and the companies you work with.
Yeah, so let's really rewind in time to baseline linear regressions in the quant world and financial services, right? So where most of the stuff was being built in some sort of stats tool or in Excel or in in some sort of language, and then literally the strategies need to be embedded in C into trading systems. So it's a lossy process when you do language translations. You lose precision on the stats libraries that you use. You see differences. So that in itself can be problematic. And so we saw that, you mentioned it, going from the SAS world or the R, when people have to say, okay, if I need to translate my R into Java because of the application, first of all, it's not usually the same person. So,
and the Java developer doesn't necessarily get the stats. The stats person has no idea what the production issues are.
The libraries might have different precisions, right? So there's a whole slew of problems of when you do this interchange, and they're saying, well, why are you even translating it? It's well, Java's faster and blah blah blah, whatever the reason. So that's one trend that we saw. We also saw this trend of oh yeah, we throw it over the wall, being here's a Jupyter notebook, put an API behind it. And anybody on this call will know that is a recipe for disaster in terms of just having an API behind it. That's just not how the world works. Another trend in that same space was well, we have this containerization, which is great. We can actually package everything in a container and send it out and put it behind a Flask app with an API. And what we ended up with was these massive containers that are completely unmanageable, and you don't know what's in them. And so there's a whole bunch of problems. The throw it over the wall is this, it's evolved in my opinion, in terms of like how it's moved through the, the world. But the idea is that, when you kind of like have a third party dependency on somebody rewriting things, it's a lossy process. It's just going to be a lossy process, either in time, in precision, in accurate, like there's a whole bunch of reasons around that. And so you want to really get to a world where, okay, why are we having these people productionize it? Well, they understand the systems, they understand uptime, they understand a whole bunch of these things that maybe the data science team doesn't realize they need to care about. Okay, well, can we design a process, a platform, a methodology that can have those things implied, but still allows kind of like the data scientists to move at the speed that they want and continuously deploy and automate around that. So that's kind of where we say like breaking down the throw it over the wall, because it is a lossy process. That doesn't mean that the reasons for doing it that way have gone away. You still need, you still need to be able to kind of like automate, like these things away. You need to take care of all these things for production. So that's kind of one of the big reasons that we saw. The other one is just like repeating it. Like now we just see ML teams now being applied to everywhere in the organization. So you have to come up with a standardized way internally to do things, because if you're doing one-offs, it becomes completely unmanageable from a risk perspective, from a compliance perspective, from an uptime perspective.
Awesome. We're out of time. There is a really interesting set of questions in the chat around the relationship between the build by calculus and organization size. Be great for you to comment on that in the chat. But Diego, thanks so much for joining us at TWiMLCon and for your and Algorithmia's support of the event.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.